The clause you just said will destroy your own company. The voice didn't come from the polished end of the 12-foot walnut table, nor from the row of tailored suits lining the glass walls. It came from the side of the room, quiet but precise, cutting clean through the low hum of central air and the faint clink of crystal water glasses. Every head turned at once. Richard Whitmore's hand paused mid-gesture, 2 fingers still resting against the edge of his tablet as the final syllables of Arabic he had just spoken seemed to hang in the air, suspended like dust caught in sunlight. For a moment, no one moved. The skyline outside, 42 floors below, glimmered in the late morning haze, but inside the boardroom, everything felt sealed, airtight, waiting. Richard slowly shifted his gaze toward the source of the interruption. Near the wall, beside a service cart with neatly arranged bottles and folded linen, stood a woman in a navy housekeeping uniform. Her name tag caught the light for a split second, Ava Johnson. She didn't step forward. She didn't shrink back. She just stood there, one hand lightly resting on the cart's handle, posture straight, eyes steady, as if she had always belonged in this room. A faint crease formed between Richard's brows, not quite anger, not yet curiosity, something sharper, more calculating. Around the table, executives exchanged glances, some confused, others already suppressing small, incredulous smiles. A junior analyst leaned toward his neighbor and whispered something under his breath, the corners of his mouth twitching. No one spoke out loud. No one dared to break the tension first. Richard exhaled slowly through his nose, then straightened, his cufflink catching a glint of light as he adjusted his sleeve. "I'm sorry," he said, voice calm, measured, the kind of calm that usually ended conversations before they began. "Did you just interrupt a multi-billion-dollar negotiation?" His tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. The weight of it pressed into the room like a drop in air pressure before a storm. Ava didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched, thin and taut. Somewhere behind her, the soft whir of an HVAC vent kicked on, a low mechanical breath that only made the stillness more noticeable. She glanced once at the tablet in Richard's hand, then back at him. When she spoke again, her voice was just as even, but there was something unshakable beneath it. "You said the liability would remain flexible under regional interpretation," she said, this time in Arabic, her pronunciation crisp, each consonant landing with quiet certainty. A flicker, small, but unmistakable, crossed Richard's face. Not recognition. Not yet. But something had shifted. A senior partner from across the table leaned forward slightly, his pen hovering above his legal pad. Another executive tapped twice on a tablet screen, pulling up a translated transcript, eyes narrowing as he scanned. Ava continued, still in Arabic, not louder, not faster, just clearer. "But the phrasing you used places final authority on external arbitration panels. If signed as stated, your company forfeits control in any dispute." The words settled into the room like a second silence, heavier than the first. No one laughed now. No one whispered. Even the man who had leaned back in his chair earlier slowly sat upright, his posture tightening as understanding began to ripple, subtle but undeniable, across the faces around the table. Richard didn't move. His hand lowered from the tablet, resting flat against the polished surface, fingertips spread slightly, as if grounding himself in something solid. The reflection of his own face stared back at him from the dark wood, sharp, composed, but no longer entirely certain. And in that reflection, just over his shoulder, Ava Johnson stood still, framed by glass and light, no longer invisible. The room did not return to normal after she finished speaking. It held that silence, stretched thin but unbroken, like a pane of glass that no one wanted to touch in case it shattered. Ava felt it against her skin, in the air, in the way no one shifted in their seat anymore. She kept her posture steady, shoulders relaxed, fingers still resting on the cool metal edge of the service cart. The faint scent of lemon cleaner lingered from the cloth tucked at her side, a quiet reminder of where she was supposed to be, what role she was expected to play. Just an hour earlier, she had been on the 39th floor, moving in practiced lines across polished marble, her sneakers soft against the surface as she worked her way from one corner to the next. No one had looked at her then. No one had needed to. She had learned long ago how to exist in spaces without disturbing them, how to make herself small enough to pass through. Unnoticed. That skill had paid the rent, covered her mother's medication, kept the lights on in a one-bedroom apartment 15 miles away where the walls were thin and the mornings came too early. But invisibility had never meant ignorance. While others talked, she listened. While others assumed, she observed. Words, especially, had always stayed with her. The shape of them, the rhythm, the intent hidden just beneath what was said out loud. It started when she was a kid, sitting on a worn carpet in a public library that smelled faintly of paper and dust, flipping through language books that no one else checked out. Arabic had come later, picked up through free online lectures and late-night practice sessions, headphones on, repeating phrases until her tongue found the right placement, until the sounds stopped feeling foreign and started feeling precise. She never finished college. Life had shifted too fast for that. Hospital bills replaced tuition, and responsibility replaced time. Still, she kept learning in fragments, in quiet, in between shifts and obligations, building something no one could see because no one was looking. Now, standing in a room where every chair probably cost more than her monthly rent, she felt all of that history settle into place, not as pride, not as defiance, but as something simpler. Clarity. Across the table, Richard Whitmore tapped once on the surface in front of him, a controlled, deliberate motion that echoed faintly in the stillness. He turned slightly toward one of his senior advisors, murmuring something too low for the rest of the room to catch. The advisor's eyes moved quickly across a document, then back up again, sharper now, more alert. A subtle shift passed through the group, like a current. Ava noticed it the way she noticed everything else, without moving, without drawing attention to the fact that she was still there, still present, still part of a conversation she had not been invited into, but had stepped into anyway. The cart beside her reflected the overhead lights in soft, distorted lines, and for a brief moment, she caught her own reflection in the stainless steel surface. Same uniform, same name tag. Nothing about her appearance had changed, but the way the room held her now had. And she could feel it, not in words, but in the absence of dismissal, in the quiet recalculation happening behind every pair of eyes that had once looked straight through her. Richard Whitmore did not speak right away, and that alone was enough to unsettle the room more than any raised voice ever could. He was a man known for immediacy, for decisions delivered with the clean precision of a signature at the bottom of a page, never delayed, never uncertain. Yet now he stood still, eyes fixed on the document in front of him, as if the words he had approved just minutes earlier had shifted into something unfamiliar. The overhead lights cast a soft reflection across the polished table, catching the edge of the contract where a single paragraph sat, dense and unremarkable to anyone who did not know what to look for. Slowly, he reached forward and rotated the tablet toward himself, enlarging the section Ava had referenced. His fingers hovered for a fraction of a second before scrolling back, then forward again, tracing the language with a focus that tightened the line of his jaw. Around him, the executives followed his movements like a silent chorus, each one recalibrating their posture, their attention, their assumptions. A man near the far end adjusted his tie, the fabric sliding softly against his collar. Another leaned closer to her screen, lips pressed together as she reread the clause, this time not skimming, not trusting the summary, but absorbing every word. The shift was subtle, but it was real. What had been routine was no longer routine. What had been certain was now under question. Ava watched it unfold without moving. She did not step closer. She did not repeat herself. The point had already been made, and she understood something most people in that room were only beginning to feel. Once truth enters a space, it does not need to announce itself twice. Richard exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but heavier than before. He tapped the screen once, then looked up, not at Ava immediately, but at the senior legal advisor seated to his right. Walk me through this language, he said, voice low, steady, but no longer dismissive. The advisor hesitated, just briefly, then cleared his throat and began to read, his tone careful, measured, each word placed with growing awareness. As he spoke, the meaning sharpened. The clause did not protect. It transferred. It did not safeguard control. It diluted it. And buried within the formal phrasing was a structure that, once activated, would place final authority outside their hands. A quiet tension moved across the table, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable, like a current beneath still water. Richard's gaze shifted then, finally landing on Ava. This time, he did not look through her. He looked at her, not as a disruption, not as an inconvenience, but as a variable he had not accounted for. Something in his expression narrowed, recalculating, measuring. "You are saying," he began, each word deliberate, "that if this proceeds as written, we lose decision control in any dispute scenario." Ava met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice even, grounded, carrying no trace of triumph, only certainty. Not immediately, but inevitably. The words settled into the room with weight. Inevitably. No one repeated it, but everyone heard it. Richard's fingers pressed lightly against the table, then lifted, as if the surface itself had changed beneath his touch. He glanced once more at the claws, then back at her, and for the first time since the interruption, the confidence in his posture shifted, not collapsing, not breaking, but adjusting, making room for something he could no longer ignore. And in that adjustment, the balance of the room tilted, just enough to be felt by everyone inside it. The words did not disappear after they were spoken. They lingered, circling the room in quiet repetition, as if every mind present was testing them against its own understanding. Inevitably. It was not a dramatic word, not loud, not emotional, but it carried a kind of finality that did not need emphasis. Richard Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair, not in relaxation, but in recalibration, his eyes no longer fixed on the document alone, but moving between the faces around the table, measuring their reactions, reading the subtle shifts that confirmed what he was beginning to accept. A partner across from him cleared his throat, the sound soft but amplified in the silence. "We should verify the translation," he said, careful, diplomatic, as if offering a lifeline rather than questioning authority. Another voice followed, quieter. "We have in-house linguists on call." The suggestions stacked gently, each one an attempt to restore structure, to bring the situation back under familiar control. Ava remained where she was, her presence unchanged, but the room no longer treated her as background. Every glance that moved toward her carried weight. Now, not dismissal, not irritation, but something closer to reluctant attention. Richard raised a hand, not sharply, just enough to pause the flow of voices. The motion was small, but it reset the room instantly. He turned his chair a few degrees, aligning himself more directly with Ava, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted, still controlled, still authoritative, but stripped of the earlier assumption that he already knew the outcome. "Explain it," he said, not as a command, but as a request framed in precision. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable. Ava stepped forward then, just one step, the soft sole of her sneaker barely making a sound against the floor. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. The service cart remained behind her, a quiet marker of where she had stood, where she technically still belonged. She reached the edge of the table and stopped, maintaining a respectful distance, her hands relaxed at her sides. The document lay open in front of Richard, the clause highlighted now, enlarged on the screen. Ava glanced at it briefly, then spoke, her voice steady, paced for clarity. "The phrasing sounds flexible," she said, "but the structure is not. The moment you agree to external arbitration under that wording, you give up the ability to challenge jurisdiction. That means if there is a dispute, you are not deciding how it is resolved. Someone else is." She paused just long enough for the words to settle, then continued, not faster, not louder, just more precise. "And the way it is written, that authority cannot be reversed once it is triggered. It looks optional, but it is not. It is embedded." A faint shift moved through the room again, this time more visible. The senior legal advisor leaned closer, scanning the clause with renewed intensity, his finger tracing a line of text, as if it had only just become legible. A woman near the center of the table adjusted her glasses, her lips parting slightly as understanding caught up with her. No one interrupted. No one dismissed her. Richard watched Ava as she spoke, not just listening to the words, but to the confidence behind them, the absence of guesswork, the way she did not over-explain, did not hedge, did not soften the conclusion. When she finished, the silence returned, but it was no longer uncertain. It was processing. Richard's gaze dropped once more to the screen, then lifted again, slower this time. "And you are certain," he said, each word deliberate, that this interpretation holds under international contract law. Ava met his eyes without flinching. Yes, sir, she replied. Because that is exactly how it is designed to hold. The statement did not echo. It landed. And in that landing, something irreversible shifted, not just in the document, not just in the deal, but in the space between the people in that room, where authority had just been quietly, unmistakably challenged by someone who had never been expected to speak at all. The silence did not hold the same shape anymore. It tightened. What had been quiet curiosity now edged into discomfort, the kind that settles in when certainty begins to slip. A man near the far end of the table let out a short, controlled breath, then leaned back in his chair, arms crossing loosely as if distancing himself from the document in front of him. Another executive tapped the side of her tablet, pulling up a secondary translation feed, her eyes scanning quickly, then slowing, then stopping altogether. The shift was no longer subtle. It was visible, measurable, spreading. Richard Whitmore did not immediately respond to Ava's final statement. Instead, he turned slightly to his left, toward a man seated beside a stack of printed contracts, a senior advisor whose reputation had been built on precision and foresight. You reviewed this, Richard said, his tone even, but the weight behind it unmistakable. The advisor straightened, adjusting his glasses with a small, deliberate motion. Yes, he replied, voice steady, though a fraction tighter than before. Multiple times. Richard nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, then gestured lightly toward the screen. And you did not see this exposure. It was not phrased as a question. The advisor's eyes dropped to the clause again, scanning, rescanning, as if repetition might produce a different result. The language is layered, he said carefully. It is not immediately apparent. A faint murmur passed through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but enough to signal that the foundation beneath the conversation was no longer stable. Ava stood still at the edge of the table, aware of the tension but not reacting to it. She had seen this moment before, not in boardrooms like this, not with people in tailored suits and polished shoes, but in smaller ways, quieter ways, when someone realized too late that something they trusted was not what it seemed. It always felt the same. A pause, a recalculation, a quiet resistance before acceptance. Richard's fingers tapped once against the table, then stilled. His gaze moved across the room again, slower this time, taking in each face, each posture, each unspoken reaction. The authority he carried was still there, intact, but it was no longer unchallenged. We are not moving forward with this version, he said finally, the decision landing clean, decisive, cutting through the uncertainty like a line drawn across a page. A few shoulders lowered, a few breaths released, but the tension did not disappear. It shifted direction. Now it pointed somewhere else. Toward Ava. Richard turned back to her, his expression composed, but different now, less dismissive, more deliberate. You stepped into a negotiation you were not part of, he said, not harshly, but clearly. The statement hung in the air, balanced between acknowledgement and consequence. Several heads turned again, watching, waiting, as if expecting the room to correct itself, to re-establish the boundaries that had just been crossed. Ava did not step back. She did not apologize. Her hands remained relaxed at her sides, her posture unchanged. Yes, sir, she said simply. No defense, no explanation, just truth. The simplicity of it unsettled more than any argument could have. A faint smile, thin and uncertain, flickered across the face of one executive before disappearing just as quickly. Another shifted in his seat, glancing briefly at Richard, then away. The room was waiting again, but this time not for translation, not for clarification, but for judgment. And in that suspended moment, the question was no longer about the contract. It was about her. No one spoke after her answer. The room did not rush to fill the silence this time. It allowed it to exist, to stretch, to settle into the corners of the glass walls and the polished floor, as if even the space itself needed a moment to adjust to what had just happened. Ava could hear the faint hum of the city beyond the windows, distant traffic moving in slow patterns far below, muted by layers of steel and height. Inside, everything felt suspended. Richard Whitmore remained still, his gaze fixed on her, not with anger, not with approval, but with a kind of measured stillness that suggested he was choosing his next words carefully. His hand rested flat against the table, fingers slightly spread, no longer tapping, no longer signaling control, just present. The executives around him did not interrupt. A few glanced down at their notes, though no one wrote anything. One man adjusted the angle of his pen and then set it back down without using it. Another leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, eyes drifting briefly toward the skyline before returning to the center of the room. The energy had shifted from reaction to reflection. Ava stood quietly, aware of every detail without focusing on any single one. The cool air against her skin, the faint pressure of her shoes against the floor, the weight of attention that no longer passed through her but rested on her. It would have been easy to step back, to return to the cart, to let the moment dissolve into something safer, something expected. But she did not move. Not forward. Not back. She simply stayed. In that stillness, something subtle settled inside her. Not confidence in the way people usually describe it, not something loud or visible, but a quiet alignment between what she knew and what she had chosen to say. She had not spoken to prove anything. She had spoken because the truth had been there, and ignoring it had not been an option. Across the table, Richard finally shifted, just slightly, his shoulders easing back as if releasing a tension he had not acknowledged until now. His eyes moved away from Ava for a moment, dropping to the document again, then lifting toward the skyline, then back to her. The movement was slow, deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice carried a different weight, less force, more consideration. "Do you understand?" he said, each word measured. "What stepping into this room like that could cost you?" It was not a threat. It was not a warning. It was a recognition of reality, of structure, of the unspoken rules that govern spaces like this. Ava held his gaze, her expression unchanged. "Yes, sir," she answered. Her voice remained steady, but softer now, not weaker, just grounded. "I do." Another pause followed, but it was not empty. It was full of something unspoken, something shared, even if only for a moment, between two people standing on opposite ends of a system. Neither of them had created. Richard studied her, not quickly, not dismissively, but with attention that did not rush to a conclusion. Around them, the room remained quiet, not out of uncertainty anymore, but out of respect for what was unfolding. The sunlight had shifted slightly, angling across the table, catching the edge of Ava's name tag again, reflecting it faintly onto the surface below. Ava Johnson. The letters were small, simple, easily overlooked. But in that moment, nothing about her felt small, and no one in the room looked away. The shift did not announce itself with noise. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a change in pressure before a storm breaks. Richard Whitmore's gaze moved from Ava to the document once more, but this time there was no resistance in the motion, no attempt to reassert control through dismissal or authority. Instead, there was recognition. He reached forward and tapped the screen, pulling up a secondary legal reference, then another, cross-checking the clause against international arbitration standards. His movements were precise, practiced, but no longer automatic. Each action carried intention. Around the table, others followed his lead, screens lighting up in sequence, fingers scrolling, eyes narrowing, not out of skepticism toward Ava, but toward their own previous certainty. A senior partner adjusted his chair and leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the table, his voice lower than before when he finally spoke. "He is right," he said, but then corrected himself almost immediately, glancing toward Ava. "She is right. Under Article 32, that clause would default to external enforcement if triggered." The correction was small, but it did not go unnoticed. Another executive nodded slowly, her lips pressing together as she reviewed a parallel case file. "There would be no internal override," she added. "Once it is activated, jurisdiction shifts permanently." The words settled into the room with a finality that did not need repetition. Richard did not interrupt them. He listened, fully. His eyes moved once more to Ava, and this time there was no calculation left, no attempt to measure or test her certainty. The answer had already been confirmed, not by her alone now, but by the very system he trusted. And that changed everything. He leaned back slightly, exhaling in a controlled breath, his hand lifting from the table and resting against the arm of his chair. For a moment, he said nothing. The Silence returned again, but it was different now. Not tense. Not uncertain. It was the kind of silence that follows realization, when the outcome has already shifted and everyone in the room feels it at the same time. Ava remained still, her posture unchanged, but something inside the room had moved around her, aligning in a way it had not before. She was no longer an interruption. She was part of the conclusion. Richard's gaze held on her a moment longer before he spoke, his voice lower, steadier, stripped of the earlier edge. If we had signed this, he said, not to her alone, but to the room, we would have handed over control without a path back. No one argued. No one corrected him. A few heads nodded, slow and deliberate, the kind of acknowledgement that carried weight beyond agreement. Richard's fingers tapped once against the armrest, then stilled. He turned slightly, addressing the table again. We revised the entire section, he said. No external arbitration without internal override. Not negotiable. The decision landed clean, immediate, unquestioned. But even as the room began to shift into action, notes being taken, documents being flagged, there was a lingering awareness that something else had already been decided, something not written in any contract. Richard looked back at Ava one last time, and for the first time since she had spoken, there was no distance in his expression. Only acknowledgement. Not loud. Not performative. Just real. And in that quiet recognition, the balance that had once defined the room did not return to what it was before. The movement in the room resumed, but it did not erase what had just happened. Papers shifted, screens updated, voices returned in low, controlled tones as the negotiation recalibrated itself around the revised terms. Yet beneath that motion, something remained still, something that did not return to its previous place. Ava felt it as clearly as the cool air against her skin. She stepped back, not abruptly, not as a retreat, but as a quiet acknowledgement that her role in the moment had ended. Her hand found the handle of the service card again, fingers resting lightly against the metal as if reconnecting with something familiar. The cloth was still there, folded neatly, the faint scent of cleaner grounding her in the routine she knew. For a second, it would have been easy to disappear, back into that rhythm, to let the room absorb her presence and then forget it again. But before she could move, Richard Whitmore spoke. Miss Johnson. The name landed differently than anything else had. Not loud, not forceful, but deliberate. It carried across the room and settled with a clarity that paused every other sound just long enough to be noticed. Ava turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze again. He remained seated, posture composed, but there was no distance in his expression now, no barrier of assumption or dismissal. Only focus. Stay, he said. One word. No explanation attached to it. No condition stated. But the meaning was not unclear. Around the table, a few heads lifted, attention shifting once more, but this time without tension, without resistance. The word did not feel like a command. It felt like a decision already made. Ava did not respond immediately. The moment stretched, not uncomfortably, but with weight. She glanced briefly at the cart beside her, at the tools that had defined her place in this building for months, then back at Richard. Her voice, when it came, was calm, steady, unchanged. Yes, sir. No hesitation. No disbelief. Just acceptance of the moment as it stood. Richard gave a small nod, once, acknowledging the answer without expanding on it. He turned slightly, addressing the room again, his tone returning to business, but not entirely the same as before. We reconvene in 30 minutes with revised language, he said. Legal will restructure the clause. I want full internal control retained. The room responded immediately, motion returning with purpose, conversations forming in focused clusters, assistants stepping forward to gather documents and relay instructions. But even as the structure of the meeting resumed, Ava remained where she was, no longer at the edge, no longer outside the conversation entirely. A chair near the end of the table was pulled back slightly, almost absent-mindedly by one of the associates shifting positions, leaving a space that had not been there before. No one pointed to it. No one explained it. But it existed. Ava noticed it, not with surprise, but with quiet awareness. She moved forward, not quickly, not cautiously, just steadily, and stopped beside the chair. For a moment, she rested her hand on its back, feeling the smooth wood beneath her fingers, the solid presence of something she had not been offered before. Then, she sat, not as someone claiming power, not as someone proving a point, but as someone who had been seen and no longer needed to remain standing at the wall. The room did not stop for her. It did not need to. The shift had already happened. And in that simple motion, quiet and unannounced, the distance between who she had been when she entered and who she was now closed without a single word needing to explain it. The meeting did not end with applause or acknowledgement. It ended the way most decisions in that room did, quietly, efficiently, with people gathering their devices, closing folders, and stepping into the next task as if nothing unusual had occurred. But something had changed, and it lingered in the small details. The way a few executives paused before leaving, their eyes drifting briefly toward Ava without the reflex of looking away. The way a junior associate hesitated at the door, as if considering saying something, then chose silence instead. The room emptied gradually, the low murmur of conversation fading into the hallway beyond, replaced by the soft hum of the building settling back into its usual rhythm. Ava remained seated for a moment longer after the others had begun to leave. The chair felt solid beneath her, unfamiliar but not uncomfortable. In front of her, the screen still displayed the revised clause, now marked with track changes, the language reshaped, controlled, corrected. She did not reach for it. She did not need to. The work she had done was already part of it. Across the table, Richard Whitmore stood, gathering a thin stack of documents into alignment with a precise tap against the surface. He did not rush. He never did. When he looked up, his gaze met hers again, direct, steady, without the distance that had once defined it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not empty. It carried everything that had been said, everything that had shifted, everything that did not need to be repeated. Richard gave a small nod, not formal, not performative, but real. Ava returned it, just as simply. No words. None were needed. He turned then, moving toward the door, his steps measured, his posture unchanged, but something in the way he carried himself felt lighter, as if a layer of certainty had been replaced with something more aware. The door opened, then closed behind him with a soft click, leaving the room still once more. Ava exhaled slowly, a breath she had not realized she had been holding. She placed her hands lightly on the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath her fingertips, then pushed herself up from the chair. The movement was unhurried. She walked back toward the service cart, her steps quiet against the floor, the same path she had taken countless times before. The cloth was still there, folded exactly as she had left it. She picked it up, the fabric familiar in her hand, grounding. For a moment, she stood still, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched wide below, sunlight reflecting off glass and steel, cars moving in steady lines, people too small to distinguish, each carrying their own stories, their own invisible moments. She could see her faint reflection in the glass, layered over the skyline. Same uniform, same name tag, Ava Johnson. Nothing about that had changed. And yet, everything had. She turned slightly, the light catching the edge of her badge again, reflecting it softly against the window. No one was there to see it now. No one needed to. The room was quiet, but it was not the same quiet as before. It held something new, something settled, something that did not need recognition to exist. Ava folded the cloth once, carefully, then placed it back on the cart. Her hand rested on the handle for a brief second before she began to move, guiding it toward the door. The wheels rolled smoothly, the sound soft, steady, familiar. As she reached the threshold, she paused, just for a moment, not looking back, not waiting, just standing in the space between where she had been and where she was going. Then she stepped forward, and the door closed gently behind her, leaving the room filled with nothing but light, reflection, and the quiet weight of a truth that had already taken its place.